A leader dared to stand against one of the world's most powerful nations, not with weapons, but through reforms that aimed to improve the lives of his people. Jacobo Árbenz, a military officer who became president of Guatemala in the 1950s, had a bold vision. He wanted to create a fair and just society where land and wealth were more equally shared. But his efforts to reform Guatemala's economy, especially through land redistribution, put him in direct conflict with the United States. The U.S. had significant economic interests in Guatemala, mainly through the United Fruit Company, which owned vast amounts of land. Árbenz's land reforms threatened this company's control and profits, and that's when the U.S. government began to act. Labeling him as a threat to stability, the U.S. sought to remove Árbenz from power. This conflict would ultimately lead to his downfall, as the CIA orchestrated a coup that forced him out of office in 1954. The consequences of Árbenz's overthrow were disastrous for Guatemala, leading to decades of instability and violence. Yet, his story is a key part of Latin America's larger struggle against foreign control and intervention. To this day, Jacobo Árbenz remains a symbol of defiance, his legacy felt in movements that continue to fight for sovereignty and justice in the region. In this video, we'll explore how his plans for reform clashed with U.S. interests, and what led to one of the most significant interventions in Latin American history. Early life. Jacobo Árbenz was born in 1913 in Quetzaltenango, the second largest city in Guatemala. His father, Hans Jacob Árbenz Grobli, was a Swiss-German pharmacist who moved to Guatemala in 1901. His mother, Octavia Guzmán Caballeros, came from a middle-class family and worked as a primary school teacher. Árbenz grew up in a relatively wealthy family, but that changed when his father became addicted to morphine. This addiction led to the collapse of the family business, and they eventually had to move to a rural estate provided by a wealthy friend out of charity. Originally, Jacobo wanted to study economics or engineering, but the family's financial situation made that impossible. Since there was a military scholarship available at the Polytechnic School of Guatemala, he decided to apply. He passed the entrance exams and became a cadet in 1932. His father tragically took his own life 2 years after Jacobo joined the academy. Árbenz excelled as a cadet and was known for his exceptional abilities. He earned the prestigious rank of First Sergeant, a rare honor. His talents earned him respect from both Guatemalan and U.S. officers, including Major John Considine, the U.S. director of the academy. After graduating in 1935, Árbenz served in different positions, including as a junior officer at Fort San Jose and later in a small garrison in San Juan Zacatepeques, where he witnessed forced labor, a situation that deeply affected him. In 1937, Árbenz returned to the academy as a teacher, where he taught subjects like history, military tactics, and physics. He quickly rose through the ranks and was promoted to captain in 1943. Around this time, he met Maria Villanova, the daughter of a wealthy Salvadoran family. They married shortly after, despite her family's disapproval. Maria played a significant role in Árbenz's political thinking, introducing him to Marxist ideas. Through her, Árbenz started reading works by Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, which deeply influenced his views on social reform and justice in Guatemala. October Revolution and Defense Ministership. In 1871, the government of Justo Rufino Barrios passed laws that took away land from the native Mayan people. They were forced to work on coffee plantations for very little pay. Several companies from the United States, like the United Fruit Company, were given this land and didn't have to pay taxes on it. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, the economy crashed, and unemployment rose, causing unrest among workers. Fearing a revolution, the elite supported Jorge Ubico, who became president in 1931. There was no real competition in that election, as Ubico was the only candidate. With support from the U.S., Ubico became one of the harshest dictators in Latin America. He ended the old system of debt labor and replaced it with a law requiring all men who didn't own land to do at least 100 days of forced labor. The government also used unpaid labor from indigenous people to build public infrastructure, like roads and railways. Yubico kept wages low and passed a law that gave landowners the power to do anything to protect their property, even kill workers without facing punishment. These harsh policies caused deep resentment among farm workers. Yubico had little respect for the indigenous population, even comparing them to animals. He gave 200,000 hectares of public land to the United Fruit Company and allowed the U.S. military to set up bases in Guatemala. October Revolution. In May 1944, protests against Yubico began at the university in Guatemala City. In response, Yubico suspended the constitution on June 22, 1944. The protests grew, with students, workers, middle-class citizens, and junior army officers joining in. By the end of June, the pressure forced Yubico to resign. He left a three-person junta in charge, led by General Federico Ponce Vades. Although Ponce promised free elections, when Congress met on July 3, soldiers forced them at gunpoint to appoint Ponce as interim president. The repressive policies of Yubico's rule continued under Ponce. Opposition groups, including many political and military leaders, began organizing again, viewing Ponce's regime as unconstitutional. Árbenz, one of the few officers to protest against Ponce, had been fired from his teaching job at the military academy by Yubico and had since moved to El Salvador, where he organized a group of revolutionary exiles. He became a key leader in the army's plot to overthrow Ponce, along with Major Aldana Sandoval. Árbenz insisted on including civilians in the coup, despite objections from other military members. On October 19, 1944, a group of soldiers and students, led by Árbenz and Francisco Javier Arana, attacked the National Palace, an event later known as the October Revolution. Arana hadn't been involved initially, but his position in the army was crucial to its success. By the next day, more soldiers and civilians joined the revolutionaries. Despite initial setbacks, their ranks grew with unionists and students, and they eventually defeated the forces loyal to Ponce. On October 20, Ponce surrendered unconditionally. Árbenz and Arana both played significant roles during the revolt. And both were promoted, Árbenz to lieutenant colonel and Arana to full colonel. The junta that took power promised free elections for the presidency, Congress, and a constituent assembly. The resignation of Ponce and the establishment of the junta marked the start of the Guatemalan Revolution. However, the interests of the elite weren't immediately challenged. 2 days after Ponce's resignation, a violent protest broke out in Patricia, which the junta quickly and harshly suppressed, resulting in the deaths of civilians, including women and children. In December 1944, elections were held. And despite only literate men being allowed to vote, they were largely considered free and fair. None of the junta members ran in the elections. The winner, Juan José Arevalo, a teacher, received 85% of the vote. He represented a coalition of leftist parties called the Revolutionary Action Party (PAR). Arana, who didn't want to transfer power to a civilian government, tried to convince Árbenz and Torriello to delay the elections. And after Arevalo's victory, he pushed for the results to be declared invalid. However, Árbenz and Torriello insisted that Arevalo be allowed to take power. Arana finally agreed, on the condition that his role as commander of the military remained secure. The new Constitution of 1945 created the position of Commander of the Armed Forces, a powerful role that was even stronger than that of the defense minister. Arana took this position, while Árbenz became the new defense minister when Arevalo was inaugurated as president. Government of Juan José Arevalo. Arevalo described his beliefs as spiritual socialism. He was against communism and supported a capitalist society, but he wanted to make sure its benefits reached everyone. This idea was reflected in the new constitution that was approved after he became president. It was one of the most forward-thinking in Latin America at the time. It allowed voting rights to all but illiterate women, decentralized power, and created a multi-party system. However, communist parties were banned. Once in office, Arevalo introduced several reforms, including minimum wage laws, more funding for education, and changes to labor laws. These reforms mainly helped the upper middle class, but they didn't do much for the rural workers who made up most of the population. Despite being focused on liberal and capitalist policies, Arevalo was still viewed with suspicion by the United States, which later accused him of being a communist. When Árbenz became defense minister under President Arevalo, he was the first to hold this role under its new name, which had previously been called the Ministry of War. In late 1947, Árbenz spoke out against the deportation of workers accused of being communists. This caught the attention of well-known communist José Manuel Fortuny, who met Árbenz and found him to be different from the typical Central American military officer. They had several discussions, and Árbenz started spending time with Fortuny at his home, talking for hours. Both men shared a desire to improve life for the people of Guatemala and looked to Marxist ideas for solutions. This relationship would play a significant role in shaping Árbenz's future. On December 16, 1945, President Arevalo was injured in a car accident. While he was recovering, members of the Revolutionary Action Party, PAR, worried that Arana might use the opportunity to stage a coup. To prevent this, they made a deal with Arana, later known as the Pacto del Barranco. Arana agreed not to seize power, and in exchange, the PAR would support his candidacy in the upcoming presidential election scheduled for November 1950. Although Arevalo recovered quickly, he was forced to go along with the deal. However, by 1949, tensions between Arana and the political parties increased. The left-leaning parties decided to back Árbenz instead, believing he was the only military officer who could stand up to Arana. In 1947, Arana demanded that certain labor leaders be deported. But Árbenz disagreed, stepping in to prevent the deportation of many of them. Arevalo's land reforms worried the wealthy landowners, who saw their interests being threatened. They began supporting Arana as their preferred candidate, hoping he would roll back Arevalo's changes. In the summer of 1949, tensions rose within the Guatemalan military as officers debated who would take over after Arana. On July 16, Arana gave Arevalo an ultimatum, demanding that Árbenz's supporters be removed from their positions, or he would stage a coup. Arevalo informed Árbenz and other leaders of this threat, and they agreed that Arana should be exiled. On July 18, Arana met with Arevalo again, but on his way back, Arana's convoy was ambushed by a group led by Árbenz. A gunfight broke out, and Arana was killed. Historian Piero Gleijeses suggested that Árbenz likely intended to capture, not kill, Arana. Arana's supporters in the military attempted a revolt, but without a leader, they quickly sought negotiations. The coup attempt resulted in around 150 deaths and 200 injuries. Some government officials, including Árbenz, wanted the full truth to be made public, but they were overruled. Arevalo gave a speech stating that Arana had been killed because he refused to lead a coup. Árbenz stayed silent about the incident for years, only speaking of it in 1968 after obtaining Arevalo's permission. During their exile, Árbenz tried to convince Arevalo to reveal the truth, but Arevalo refused, and Árbenz didn't push the matter. 1950 election. Árbenz's role as defense minister had already positioned him as a strong contender for the presidency. His loyalty during the 1949 uprising only boosted his reputation further. In 1950, the economically moderate Partido de Integridad Nacional (PIN) announced Árbenz as their candidate for the upcoming presidential election. This was soon followed by support from most left-leaning parties, including the influential PAR and several labor unions. Árbenz strategically chose the PIN for his nomination to present himself as more moderate, based on advice from his friends and colleagues. On February 20, 1950, Árbenz resigned as defense minister and officially launched his presidential campaign. Although Arevalo wrote him an enthusiastic private letter, he publicly offered only a lukewarm endorsement, as it was believed that he favored his friend Victor Manuel Jordani, the health minister. However, with Árbenz gaining widespread support and Giordani having little chance of success, Arevalo eventually backed Árbenz. Arana, who had planned to run in the 1950 elections before his death, had been the only real competition for Árbenz. This left Árbenz with only a few serious challengers, including Jorge García Granados. Supported by members of the upper middle class who felt the revolution had gone too far. And Miguel Adigueras Fuentes, a former general under Ubico with backing from the hardline opponents of the revolution. Throughout his campaign, Árbenz promised to continue and expand the reforms initiated by Arevalo. Árbenz was widely expected to win due to his support from major political parties and labor unions, which campaigned heavily for him. Additionally, his personal appeal was noted, as he was described as having a charismatic personality and a strong voice. His wife, Maria, also actively campaigned with him, and despite her privileged background, she advocated for the interests of the Mayan peasants, becoming a national figure. Their two daughters occasionally appeared with him in public as well. On November 15, 1950, the election was held, and Árbenz won over 60% of the vote. The elections were mostly free and fair, aside from the disenfranchisement of illiterate women. Árbenz received more than 3 times the votes of the runner-up, Adigueras Fuentes, who accused him of electoral fraud. However, scholars have suggested that while there may have been some irregularities, they were not the reason for Árbenz's overwhelming victory. His promise of land reform played a major role in his success. Árbenz's election caused concern within the U.S. State Department, as they believed that Arana had been the only conservative force in the Arevalo administration. And his death would lead to a stronger leftist influence in the government. Árbenz was officially inaugurated as president on March 15, 1951. Presidency. In his inaugural address, Árbenz promised to transform Guatemala from a backward country with a predominantly feudal economy into a modern capitalist state. He expressed his intention to reduce dependency on foreign markets and limit the influence of foreign corporations on Guatemalan politics. Árbenz emphasized the need to modernize Guatemala's infrastructure without relying on foreign investment. Following advice from the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, he aimed to build more houses, ports, and roads. Árbenz also sought to reform Guatemala's economic institutions, planning to construct factories, increase mining activities, expand transportation infrastructure, and grow the banking system. Land reform was the cornerstone of his election campaign. And the revolutionary organizations that had helped bring him to power continually pressured him to fulfill his promises regarding land reform. At the time he took office, a mere 2% of the population owned 70% of the land, which had been a taboo subject for the previous Arevalo administration. Historian Jim Handy characterized Árbenz's economic and political ideals as decidedly pragmatic and capitalist in nature. According to historian Stephen Schlesinger, while Árbenz had a few communists in lower-level roles within his administration, he was neither a dictator nor a hidden communist. Schlesinger described him as a democratic socialist. Nonetheless, some of Árbenz's policies, particularly those related to agrarian reform, were labeled communist by the Guatemalan upper class and the United Fruit Company. Historian Piero Gleijeses noted that while Árbenz's policies were intentionally capitalist, his personal beliefs gradually leaned toward communism. His goal was to enhance Guatemala's economic and political independence, which he believed required a strong domestic economy. Árbenz made efforts to connect with the indigenous Mayan people, sending government representatives to communicate with them. From these interactions, he learned that the Maya valued dignity and self-determination. Inspired by this, he stated in 1951 that, if the independence and prosperity of our people were incompatible, which they are not, I am sure that the great majority of Guatemalans would prefer to be a poor nation, but free, rather than a rich colony, but enslaved. While Árbenz's policies were based on a moderate form of capitalism, the communist movement gained strength during his presidency. This growth was partly due to Arevalo releasing imprisoned communist leaders in 1944 and the influence of the teachers' union. Although the Communist Party was banned for much of the Guatemalan Revolution, the government welcomed many communist and socialist refugees escaping dictatorial regimes from neighboring countries, which further strengthened the movement. Árbenz had personal connections with some members of the legalized Guatemalan Party of Labor, including José Manuel Fortuny. Fortuny served as a friend and advisor to Árbenz from 1951 to 1954. Writing several speeches for him and helping to craft the significant agrarian reform bill as the agricultural secretary. Despite his role in the government, Fortuny did not gain significant popularity among the public. The Communist Party remained small, lacking representation in Árbenz's cabinet, with only a few communists appointed to lower-level positions. Árbenz read and admired the works of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, prior to Khrushchev's report. Some officials in his government praised Stalin as a great statesman and leader. In 1953, the Guatemalan Congress observed a moment of silence to honor Stalin's death, an action noted by later observers. While Árbenz had some support among communist members of the legislature, they were only a minor part of the overall government coalition. Land reform. The main focus of Árbenz's modernization plan was his agrarian reform bill. Árbenz personally drafted this bill with input from advisors, including some leaders of the Communist Party and non-communist economists, as well as economists from across Latin America. The National Assembly passed the bill on June 17, 1952, and it took effect immediately. The bill aimed to transfer uncultivated land from large landowners to impoverished laborers, enabling them to start their own viable farms. Árbenz was also motivated to pass this bill to generate capital for his public infrastructure projects, especially after the United States had pressured the World Bank to deny Guatemala a loan in 1951, worsening the capital shortage. The official name of the Agrarian Reform Bill was Decree 900. It expropriated all uncultivated land from estates larger than 673 acres, 272 hectares. For estates between 672 acres and 224 acres, uncultivated land was taken only if less than two-thirds of it was being used. Landowners received government bonds as compensation, equal to the value of the expropriated land, which was based on what they had declared in their 1952 tax returns. Local committees, including representatives from landowners, laborers, and the government, organized the redistribution. Out of nearly 350,000 private landholdings, only 1,710 were affected by expropriation. Although the law was framed within a moderate capitalist approach, its rapid implementation sometimes led to arbitrary land seizures and instances of violence directed at both landowners and small-scale peasants. Árbenz, who owned land through his wife, relinquished 1,700 acres as part of the reform. By June 1954, approximately 1.4 million acres of land had been expropriated and distributed, benefiting around 500,000 people, or one-sixth of the population. The decree also provided financial support for those who received land. The National Agrarian Bank, Banco Nacional Agrario, or BNA, was established on July 7, 1953. And by June 1954, it had distributed over $9 million in small loans to 53,829 applicants, who received an average of $225, double the Guatemalan per capita income. The BNA gained a reputation as an efficient government agency. And even the U.S. government, which was critical of Árbenz, had no complaints about it. The loans had a high repayment rate. Out of $3,371,185 distributed between March and November 1953, $3,049,092 had been repaid by June 1954. The law also included provisions for nationalizing roads that passed through redistributed land, significantly improving connectivity for rural communities. Contrary to critics' predictions, the law led to a slight increase in agricultural productivity and an expansion of cultivated areas. There was also a rise in farm machinery purchases. Overall, the law improved living standards for many farming families, most of whom were indigenous people. Historian Piero Gligises noted that the injustices corrected by the law outweighed the relatively few arbitrary land seizures. Historian Greg Grandin pointed out that while the law had flaws, such as being overly cautious and creating divisions among farmers, it represented a significant shift in power toward those who had previously been marginalized. In 1953, the Supreme Court declared the reform unconstitutional, but the Guatemalan Congress later impeached 4 judges linked to that ruling. Relationship with the United Fruit Company. Historians have described the relationship between Árbenz and the United Fruit Company, UFC, as a key moment in U.S. influence in Central America. Founded in 1899, the United Fruit Company held vast amounts of land and railroads throughout Central America, which it used to export bananas. By 1930, it had become the largest landowner and employer in Guatemala. In exchange for support from UFC, President Jacobo signed a contract granting the company a 99-year lease on large areas of land and exemptions from almost all taxes. Jacobo also instructed the company to pay its workers only 50 cents a day to keep wages low and discourage other workers from asking for raises. Additionally, the company effectively controlled Puerto Barrios, Guatemala's sole Atlantic port. By 1950, the UFC was earning $65 million annually, twice the revenue of the Guatemalan government. As a result, the company was viewed as an obstacle to progress by the revolutionary movement that arose after 1944. Being the largest landowner and employer in the country, the UFC was more affected by the reforms of Arévalo's government than other companies, leading to the perception that it was being specifically targeted. The company's labor issues intensified in 1952 when Árbenz enacted Decree 900, the agrarian reform law. Of the 550,000 acres it owned, only 15% was being cultivated, leaving the idle land vulnerable to expropriation under the new law. Moreover, Árbenz supported a strike by UFC workers in 1951, which led the company to rehire several laid-off employees. In response, the United Fruit Company launched a vigorous lobbying effort against Árbenz in the United States. The Guatemalan government countered by stating that the company was the main barrier to the country's progress. American historians noted that Guatemalans felt their country was being exploited by foreign interests that profited significantly without contributing to the nation's welfare. In 1953, Árbenz expropriated 200,000 acres of uncultivated land under the agrarian reform law and offered the company compensation at $2.99 per acre, double what it had originally paid for the land. This led to even more lobbying efforts in Washington, particularly through Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, who had strong connections to the UFC. The company initiated a public relations campaign to discredit the Guatemalan government, spending over $500,000 to persuade U.S. lawmakers and the public that Árbenz's government needed to be overthrown. Coup d'état. Political motives. Several factors beyond the lobbying efforts of the United Fruit Company pushed the United States to launch a coup against Árbenz in 1954. As the Cold War escalated, the U.S. government became increasingly suspicious of the Guatemalan Revolution, particularly as the Guatemalan government often clashed with American corporations. Concerns about communist influence also grew, although historian Richard H. Immerman noted that during the early Cold War, the U.S. and the CIA were inclined to view the revolutionary government as communist. Despite Árbenz's earlier ban on the Communist Party during his presidency from 1945 to 1951, the U.S. feared that Árbenz's successful reforms might inspire similar movements in other countries. Up until the end of Truman's term, the administration focused on diplomatic and economic methods to reduce communist influence. Árbenz's implementation of Decree 900 in 1952 prompted Truman to authorize Operation PB Fortune, a secret plan to overthrow him. This operation had initially been suggested by Anastasio Somoza Garcia, the U.S.-backed dictator of Nicaragua, who claimed he could overthrow the Guatemalan government if given weapons. The plan was set to be led by Carlos Castillo Armas. However, the U.S. State Department discovered the conspiracy, leading Secretary of State Dean Acheson to convince Truman to cancel the operation. After Dwight Eisenhower became president in November 1952, he was more inclined to use military action against regimes he opposed. Many officials in his administration, including Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles, had close ties to the United Fruit Company. John Foster Dulles had previously represented the company as a lawyer, while Allen Dulles served on its board. Thomas Dudley Cabot, a former CEO of United Fruit, worked in the State Department as the Director of International Security Affairs. Additionally, Under-Secretary of State Bedell Smith later joined the UFC as a director. And the wife of the UFC's public relations director was Eisenhower's personal assistant. These connections made the Eisenhower administration more willing to support a coup against the Guatemalan government. Operation PB Success. In August 1953, Eisenhower authorized the CIA operation to remove Jacobo Árbenz, known as Operation PB Success. Carlos Castillo Armas, once a lieutenant of another coup leader, was selected to lead this operation. Castillo Armas gathered about 150 mercenaries from Guatemalan exiles and nearby countries. In January 1954, news of these plans leaked to the Guatemalan government, which issued statements about a government of the North trying to overthrow Árbenz. The U.S. government denied these allegations, and the media generally supported the government, claiming Árbenz had fallen prey to communist propaganda. The U.S. had ceased selling arms to Guatemala in 1951 and blocked arms purchases from other nations shortly thereafter. By 1954, Árbenz was desperate for weapons and decided to secretly acquire them from Czechoslovakia, a move seen as establishing a communist presence in the Americas. The CIA framed this shipment as Soviet interference, which became a key reason for their coup. Árbenz intended the weapons shipment to strengthen peasant militias in case of army disloyalty. However, the U.S. informed the Guatemalan military about the shipment, forcing Árbenz to give the weapons to the army and widening the divide between him and the military leaders. Castillo Armas forces invaded Guatemala on June 18, 1954. The invasion was supported by a significant psychological warfare campaign that aimed to portray Castillo Armas' victory as certain, pushing Árbenz to resign. One of the main tools used in this campaign was a radio station called the Voice of Liberation, which broadcasted news of rebel troops advancing toward the capital, leading to widespread demoralization among the army and civilians. Although Árbenz believed he could defeat Castillo Armas militarily, he feared that failing to do so would invite a U.S. invasion. He instructed Carlos Enrique Diaz, the army chief, to choose officers for a counterattack. Diaz selected loyal officers known for their integrity. By June 21, Guatemalan soldiers were gathered at Zacapa under Colonel Victor M. Leon, who was believed to support Árbenz. However, suspicions arose within the Communist Party, prompting them to send an investigator, who reported back on June 25 that the army was demoralized and unwilling to fight. The leaders of the Communist Party informed Árbenz, who sent another investigator, receiving a message urging him to resign. The officers felt that defeat was inevitable, especially with U.S. backing for the rebels, and blamed Árbenz for the situation. On June 25, Árbenz announced that the army had abandoned the government, urging civilians to arm themselves for defense. Yet, only a few hundred volunteered. Seeing this lack of support, Diaz changed his stance and plotted to overthrow Árbenz with other senior officers. They approached U.S. Ambassador John Purifoy, asking him to halt hostilities in exchange for Árbenz's resignation. Purifoy promised to arrange a truce. Ultimately, Árbenz, exhausted and wanting to preserve some of his democratic reforms, agreed to resign. After informing his cabinet, he left the presidential palace on the evening of June 27, 1954. He recorded a resignation speech that was broadcast an hour later, stating he was resigning to remove the pretext for the invasion, and expressing a desire to protect the gains of the October Revolution. He then sought political asylum at the nearby Mexican embassy. Later life. Beginning of exile. After Árbenz's resignation, his family spent 73 days at the Mexican embassy in Guatemala City, where nearly 300 other exiles also sought refuge. During this time, the CIA launched a campaign to tarnish Árbenz's image, seeking to discredit him and influence public perception. They obtained personal documents belonging to Árbenz and manipulated them before releasing portions to the press. The CIA pushed the idea that individuals like Árbenz should face prosecution in Guatemala. When the family was finally permitted to leave, Árbenz faced public humiliation at the airport. Forced to strip before cameras under the false pretense that he was smuggling jewelry he claimed to have bought for his wife, Maria Cristina Villanova. No jewelry was found, but the interrogation lasted an hour. Throughout this ordeal, the Guatemalan press portrayed Árbenz negatively, heavily influenced by the CIA's disinformation campaign. The family's journey in exile began with a move to Mexico, followed by a stop in Canada to pick up their oldest daughter, Arabella. They aimed to reach Switzerland, traveling through the Netherlands and Paris, hoping to gain citizenship based on Árbenz's Swiss heritage. However, Árbenz refused to renounce his Guatemalan nationality, believing it would end his political career. The Árbenz family faced a relentless defamation campaign orchestrated by the CIA from 1954 to 1960, which included betrayal from a close friend, Carlos Manuel Pellicer, who turned out to be a CIA informant. Europe and Uruguay. After failing to secure citizenship in Switzerland, the Árbenz family moved to Paris, where they were granted residency for a year on the condition of non-political activity. They later relocated to Prague, but after 3 months, Árbenz found the environment harsh and moved to Moscow, which was a relief for him. During his travels in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the press in Guatemala and the US continued to criticize him, labeling him as a communist for being there. After a brief stay in Moscow, Árbenz returned to Prague and then Paris. His wife Maria went to El Salvador to handle family matters, leading to their separation, which greatly affected Árbenz. He fell into depression and began drinking excessively. He made several attempts to return to Latin America and finally received permission to move to Uruguay in 1957. Despite CIA attempts to block his visa, the Uruguayan government accepted him as a political refugee. Árbenz arrived in Montevideo on May 13, 1957, and was met with hostility from a CIA-organized reception committee. However, he remained a respected figure among leftist groups in the city, which explained the CIA's antagonism. While in Montevideo, Maria joined him, and he was visited by former President Arevalo a year later. Although their initial relationship was friendly, it soon soured due to their differing views. Arevalo was not under surveillance in Uruguay and wrote articles for the press before leaving for Venezuela a year later to take up a teaching position. Initially, Árbenz had to report to the police daily, but this requirement was later eased to once every 8 days. Maria later expressed satisfaction with their hospitality in Uruguay, stating they would have stayed indefinitely if allowed. Daughter's suicide and death. After the Cuban Revolution in 1959, a representative from Fidel Castro's government invited Árbenz to Cuba, sensing an opportunity for greater freedom. He traveled to Havana in July 1960 and began participating in public events, but this proximity to Guatemala once again led to negative press coverage against him. He was offered leadership roles in revolutionary movements in Guatemala but declined, feeling pessimistic about their chances. In 1965, Árbenz was invited to the Communist Congress in Helsinki. Shortly after, his daughter Arabella tragically committed suicide in Bogotá, which deeply affected him. Following her funeral, the Árbenz family settled in Mexico City while Árbenz traveled to France and Switzerland, ultimately aiming to establish themselves in Mexico. During one of his visits to Mexico, Árbenz fell seriously ill, and by the end of 1970, his health had deteriorated significantly. He passed away shortly after, and historians differ on the circumstances of his death. Some say he died of a heart attack, while others suggest it was suicide. On October 19, 1995, Árbenz's remains were returned to Guatemala, accompanied by his widow. Upon their return, he received military honors as cannons fired in salute while his coffin was transported to San Carlos University, where students and officials paid tribute. The Universidad de San Carlos de Guatemala awarded him a posthumous decoration soon after. After leaving the university, his remains were taken to the National Palace until midnight. On October 20, 1995, thousands of Guatemalans gathered at the cemetery for his burial. During the service, then Defense Minister Gen. Marco Antonio Gonzalez remained in his car as the crowd protested, chanting against the army. Guatemalan government apology. In 1999, the Árbenz family approached the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, IACHR, seeking an apology from the Guatemalan government for the coup that removed Jacobo Árbenz from power in 1954. After years of advocacy, their case was accepted by the IACHR in 2006, which led to 5 years of negotiations. In May 2011, the Guatemalan government reached an agreement with Árbenz's family to acknowledge his legacy and apologize for its role in his ousting. This agreement included a financial settlement and a commitment to social reparations for the Guatemalan people. On October 20, 2011, President Alvaro Colom delivered the formal apology at the National Palace to Jacobo Árbenz Vilanova, the former president's son. Colom acknowledged the wrongs done to Guatemalan society, stating, "It was a crime to Guatemalan society and it was an act of aggression to a government starting its democratic spring." The agreement involved various reparative actions, including holding a public ceremony to accept responsibility, sending a letter of apology to the family, naming a hall in the National Museum of History and a highway after Árbenz, revising the national school curriculum, establishing a degree program in human rights, pluriculturalism, and reconciliation of indigenous peoples, hosting a photographic exhibition on Árbenz's legacy at the National Museum of History, recovering and publishing photographs of the Árbenz family, reissuing the book Mi Esposo, El Presidente Árbenz, My Husband, President Árbenz, preparing and publishing a biography of Árbenz, issuing postage stamps in his honor. The official statement from the government recognized its failure to uphold human rights for Árbenz and his family, including the right to a fair trial and protection under the law. Legacy. Historian Roberto Garcia Ferreira noted in 2008 that Árbenz's legacy remains controversial in Guatemala. He argued that the CIA's media campaign following the 1954 coup significantly shaped public perception of Árbenz. Garcia Ferreira emphasized that Árbenz's government sought to promote the interests of the nation's masses during a crucial period in history. Cindy Forster described the Agrarian Reform Law of 1952 as a pivotal moment, stating it disrupted the dominance of large landowners and laid the foundation for a new social order in Guatemala. This revolutionary decade is considered essential in the country's 20th century history, as it effectively addressed the demands of indigenous people, peasants, and labor movements, unlike the previous administration of Arevalo, which was more cautious. Greg Grandin pointed out that the Land Reform Decree represented a significant shift in power dynamics in Guatemala. Árbenz himself regarded the Agrarian Reform Law as the most precious fruit of the revolution and the fundamental base of the nation as a new country. However, many of the reforms introduced during the Árbenz and Arevalo administrations were largely undone by the military governments that followed. Thanks for watching. For more intriguing stories and history, make sure to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you don't miss our next video. Trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming next.